In the sweltering heat of Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, during the first days of March 1943, a wrench clattered to the concrete floor of a maintenance hangar, dropped by hands slick with engine oil and sweat. Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stood motionless, staring at what he had created, and the weight of it pressed down on him like the tropical humidity. Before him sat a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber that had been fundamentally transformed into something the United States Army Air Force had never authorized and would probably never approve. Where the aircraft's transparent bombardier nose should have been, where a man with a Norden bomb sight should sit calculating release points for precision munitions, there were instead 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns bristling from a solid metal nose. This was not a bomber anymore, not in any conventional sense. It had become a destroyer of ships, a killer of commerce, a flying battery designed to operate at altitudes so low the pilots could see the faces of the men they were about to kill. The modification was entirely unauthorized, built without official sanction from any command authority, assembled from scavenged weapons and fabricated parts in workshops that should have been performing routine maintenance. Gunn knew that what he had done could result in a court-martial, but he also knew something else with absolute certainty. This aircraft, and others like it that he had already modified, would inflict upon the Imperial Japanese Navy a defeat so catastrophic that it would alter the entire strategic situation in the Pacific theatre. What Gunn could not have known, standing there in that hangar with oil under his fingernails and rage in his heart, was that his unauthorized modifications would prove more decisive than many official weapons development programs that had consumed millions of dollars and years of engineering effort. The mathematics of victory in the Southwest Pacific were not being calculated in the comfortable offices of Washington planners or in the design departments of aircraft manufacturers. They were being written in welding shops and maintenance hangars by a 43-year-old maverick who had his own personal reasons for wanting every Japanese ship and aircraft destroyed as quickly and violently as possible. The path that led to this moment had begun more than 2 years earlier, on the 8th of December 1941, Manila time, when the date line put the Philippines a day ahead of Hawaii. Paul Irvin Gunn, who at that point was known by his actual name rather than any nickname, stood at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers methodically destroying American air power in the Philippines with the same efficiency they had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor hours earlier. As the civilian manager of Philippine Airlines, which was barely more than a startup operation, Gunn commanded 4 Beech-18 civilian aircraft. Within hours of the attack, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer those civilian aircraft for military use and commission Gunn as a captain in the Army Air Corps, a commission that was supposed to be temporary, lasting only until the immediate crisis passed. Instead, what followed would be a 3-year odyssey involving technical innovation, personal vengeance, and the systematic transformation of aerial warfare. Gunn was 42 years old at the time, a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who had put in 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator before retiring in December 1939 to take the civilian airline job. He had learned to fly aircraft back in the 1920s, had served with the legendary Top Hatters fighter squadron, and had worked as an instructor at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida. His knowledge of aircraft came not from engineering textbooks or classroom theory, but from 2 decades of actually working on them, flying them, repairing them, and occasionally crashing them and walking away. But on that December morning when Japanese bombs were falling, technical expertise was irrelevant to Gunn's most pressing concern. His wife, Clara Louise, whom everyone called Polly for reasons lost to time, and their 4 children were in Manila as Japanese ground forces advanced toward the city. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. His daughters, Connie and Julie, were younger. The family had been living in Manila while Gunn ran the airline, enjoying a comfortable expatriate existence that had vanished in a single morning of coordinated Japanese attacks. During the chaotic weeks that followed, as American and Filipino forces fell back toward the Bataan Peninsula, Gunn flew reconnaissance missions and transport runs across the rapidly disintegrating defensive perimeter. He dodged Japanese fighters in the air, survived being shot down over the jungle and walking out to safety, and immediately climbed back into another aircraft to continue flying missions. On one particularly desperate flight, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed transport aircraft into Bhutan to deliver medical supplies to besieged American troops, navigating through Japanese-controlled airspace with nothing protecting him except his skill and considerable audacity. But despite all his flying skills and all his desperate efforts, he could not reach his family in Manila. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia as part of the general withdrawal from the Philippines. He withdrew all his military pay from whatever banking facilities were still functioning, borrowed as much money as he could from fellow officers who might not survive to collect the debt, and made desperate preparations to get his family to safety. But the Japanese advance was proceeding too rapidly, and Manila was descending into chaos. His family could not make it through the confused traffic and military movements to reach the airfield in time. Gunn faced an impossible choice between abandoning his family or disobeying direct military orders during wartime. He flew to Australia because orders were orders, because the larger war effort was more important than one family, because staying would have meant death or capture without saving anyone. Within weeks, on the 20th of January 1942, Polly and the 4 children were rounded up by Japanese occupation forces, along with thousands of other enemy civilians, and taken to the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, which had been converted into an internment camp. When Gunn learned this news through fragmentary reports reaching Australia, something fundamental broke inside him. The man who continued fighting was not the same person who had evacuated from Manila. He had left his wife and 4 children in the hands of an enemy that had already demonstrated considerable brutality toward prisoners and occupied populations. Every single day they remained in that camp was a day Gunn could not protect them, could not provide for them, could not even know whether they were alive. The only thing he could do was attempt to end the war as quickly as possible by destroying everything Japanese within reach. If he could not save his family directly, he would destroy every ship, every aircraft, every supply line, every military installation that kept Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was not official United States policy or approved military strategy. This was personal vengeance disguised as tactical innovation. When Major General George Churchill Kenny arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942 to assume command of Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area, he inherited what could charitably be described as a disaster. His predecessor had been relieved of command. Morale throughout the air units was abysmal, equipment was inadequate and poorly maintained. The Japanese controlled the airspace over New Guinea and were actively threatening Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the entire theatre, had no confidence whatsoever in his air forces, and made that opinion abundantly clear in staff meetings and private conversations. Kenny was 53 years old, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star for gallantry. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and had developed a reputation for unconventional thinking and willingness to challenge established doctrine. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long lecture about the comprehensive shortcomings of Allied air power, Kenny listened politely without interrupting and then asked for one specific thing. He wanted authority to send home any officer he considered deadwood, regardless of rank or connections. MacArthur, somewhat surprised by this unusual request, agreed immediately. Within weeks, Kenny had completely reshuffled his command structure, bringing in aggressive younger officers who shared his vision and creating a forward headquarters in New Guinea to eliminate delays in decision-making. He appointed Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander and gave him unprecedented authority to change aircraft assignments based on weather conditions and tactical opportunities rather than waiting for orders to filter down from Brisbane. But organisational changes and personnel reshuffling meant absolutely nothing without effective weapons systems. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude was proving catastrophically ineffective against Japanese shipping. High-altitude bombing gave ships ample time to manoeuvre between the bomb release and impact, The B-17 Flying Fortresses, which had been promoted before the war as unstoppable strategic bombers, were hitting less than 1% of their targets when attacking ships. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with virtual impunity, while Allied bombers dropped tons of ordnance harmlessly into the ocean. Allied ground forces were dying in the jungle from disease and starvation, while fresh Japanese troops poured ashore from ships that bombers could not sink. Kenny had been thinking about this problem since 1928, when he was an instructor at the tactical school and had theorized about skip bombing. The concept involved releasing bombs at extremely low altitude so they would skip across the water surface like flat stones on a pond, then slam into the sides of ships below the waterline where armor protection was weakest. The physics were sound and the concept was elegant, but the execution proved difficult in practice. B-17 bombers lacked forward-firing armament, and coming in at masthead height meant flying through withering anti-aircraft fire with no way to suppress the defending gunners. Then Kenny discovered Paul Gunn, and the entire strategic situation began to shift. In August 1942, Kenny learned through intelligence reports that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying a 20 Havoc light bombers without any official authorization. The modifications were crude but demonstrated considerable practical understanding of aircraft systems and weapons integration. Someone had physically removed the bombardier from the transparent nose section and installed 4 50 caliber machine guns in his place, all firing forward and controlled by the pilot. The concept was to strafe Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing defensive fire before dropping bombs or rockets. Kenny investigated personally and found Captain Paul Gunn working essentially alone in maintenance facilities, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft using fabricated brackets and improvised wiring. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through pure trial and error without any formal engineering education, but he understood aircraft structures, weight distribution, and weapons systems from 2 decades of hands-on experience as an enlisted naval aviator. Most commanding officers would have immediately court-martialed Gunn for modifying military aircraft without authorization, violating technical orders, and potentially compromising flight safety. Kenny instead assigned him to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him what seemed like an impossible mission. Modify every A-20 Havoc in the theatre for low-altitude attack operations and complete the work immediately using whatever resources and methods were necessary. Gunn worked 18-hour days in sweltering maintenance hangars, scrounging weapons from crashed aircraft, fabricating mounting brackets in makeshift workshops, and personally test-flying each modification to ensure it worked under combat conditions. He added 4 50 caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted additional guns along the fuselage sides, and installed bomb racks for parachute-retarded fragmentation bombs that could be dropped at low altitude without destroying the attacking aircraft. The modified A-20AS entered combat in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna on the northern coast of Papua. The results exceeded even Kenny's optimistic expectations. The Strafer A-20S came in at treetop level with all guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before releasing their bombs. Japanese defenders, who were accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes, suddenly faced aircraft that appeared with virtually no warning at closing speeds too fast for manual gun aiming. The attack destroyed dozens of Japanese aircraft parked on the ground and demonstrated conclusively that low-level strafing could revolutionize air warfare in the Pacific. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to begin work on similar modifications for the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 was significantly larger than the A-20 and could carry more weapons and more fuel for longer-range missions. If Gunn could successfully transform the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the entire theatre. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber intended to operate at 10 to 15,000 feet. It was a twin-engine aircraft with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by two Wright R-2600 radial engines that each produced 1,700 horsepower. Standard armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns positioned for defensive purposes and 3,000 pounds of bombs carried internally. The aircraft required a crew of 5 consisting of pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator and tail gunner. The aircraft had been named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925 for publicly accusing military leadership of incompetence and criminal negligence after a Navy dirigible crashed. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually be manufactured at 2 North American aviation plants, one located in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 had achieved fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in a mission that required extraordinary skill since the bombers were not designed for carrier operations. The raid inflicted minimal physical damage on Japan, but it provided an enormous morale boost to Americans who were still reeling from Pearl Harbor, and it forced Japan to retain fighter aircraft for homeland defense rather than sending them to frontline combat zones. But the B-25's primary operational role remained medium-altitude bombing, a mission at which it was proving spectacularly ineffective against shipping targets. Gunn examined the B-25 and recognized potential that no one else in the theater had identified. The aircraft's nose section was physically large enough to accommodate multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine design provided redundancy because losing one engine would not necessarily doom the aircraft, unlike single-engine fighters. The sturdy construction could absorb substantial battle damage and continue flying. Most importantly, the Mitchell had sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 could not access. In late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia, working with Captain Jack Fox, who was the North American aviation technical representative assigned to the theater. Fox was officially supposed to ensure that all aircraft modifications followed factory specifications and maintained manufacturer warranties. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would develop into the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program in the entire war. The first technical challenge involved removing the bombardier and his entire glass nose section, which saved considerable weight and eliminated an extremely vulnerable position that was difficult to armor. Gunn replaced the glass nose with a solid metal nose containing 4 50-caliber machine guns arranged in a tight pattern, all firing forward under the pilot's control. He then added 2 more 50-caliber guns in what were called cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, positioned just below and behind the cockpit area. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, allowing them to fire without bullets passing through the propeller disc where they could strike the blades. The guns were fixed in position, firing straight ahead, and added to the overwhelming firepower the pilot could direct at a target. Then Gunn made a radical decision that demonstrated his willingness to completely abandon conventional bomber doctrine. The B-25 had a dorsal turret mounting 2 50-caliber guns positioned behind the cockpit, designed to defend against attacks from above and behind. This turret could normally rotate through a wide arc to engage enemy fighters approaching from various angles. Gunn physically locked the turret in the forward firing position, converting it from a defensive weapon into an offensive one that added 2 more guns to the pilot's firepower. The co-pilot could operate these turret guns using a gun sight installed in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously using a master trigger that would send 8 streams of 50-caliber projectiles toward the target. The modified B-25 now possessed 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second toward anything in front of the aircraft. For purposes of comparison, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50-caliber guns as its entire armament. The modified B-25 had forward firepower exceeding that of more than one fighter aircraft, concentrated in a platform that also carried 2,000 pounds of bombs and had far greater range and endurance than any fighter. The modifications created substantial engineering challenges that Gunn had to solve through experimentation and practical testing. Adding significant weight to the nose section shifted the aircraft's centre of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and potentially difficult to control, especially during landing when the tail needed to come up. Gunn compensated by repositioning equipment throughout the aircraft and ballasting the tail section with additional weight to restore proper balance. The enormous recoil force generated when 8 guns fired simultaneously created structural stress that could potentially damage the airframe. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional internal bracing and strengthened attachment points. The guns generated tremendous heat when firing extended bursts and filled the nose compartment with cordite smoke that could incapacitate anyone inside. Gunn added ventilation systems and relocated ammunition storage to reduce fire hazard. Most critically, Gunn had to solve the complex problem of gun harmonization, ensuring that all 8 guns converged their fire at a specific distance in front of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns were not properly aligned, bullets would spray across a wide area rather than concentrating on the target. Gunn developed a systematic ground testing procedure using targets positioned at measured distances, carefully adjusting each individual gun mount until all 8 weapons converged precisely on the aim point. He personally test-fired the guns and made minute adjustments, absolutely refusing to approve any aircraft for combat until it met his exacting standards. The entire modification process required approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when crews worked around the clock in rotating shifts. Gunn trained maintenance personnel to perform the work using production line techniques that improved efficiency. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to equip the 91st Bombardment Squadron with the new gunships. The squadron required a commander who understood low-altitude attack operations and was not constrained by conventional bombing doctrine learned in peacetime training. Kenny selected Major Ed Larner, an aggressive pilot who had been promoted from first lieutenant to major in just a few weeks, based on his demonstrated leadership in combat operations. Larner had proven exceptional skill in low-level attack missions and had earned Kenny's complete trust. Larner and Gunn worked together to develop the tactical procedures that would fundamentally transform naval warfare in the Pacific. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water surface, flying at maximum speed of approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they became nearly impossible for ship-mounted anti-aircraft gunners to track effectively. The closing speed was too rapid for manual gun-laying systems, and the aircraft were already past the ship before gunners could make necessary corrections. As the B-25s approached their target, pilots would open fire with all 8 forward guns at approximately 1,000 yards distance, walking the concentrated fire into the target ship as range decreased. The stream of 50 caliber bullets would methodically sweep the decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft gun crews, destroying gun positions, shredding superstructure, and creating absolute chaos among the crew. The purpose was not necessarily to sink the ship with machine gun fire alone, although the cumulative damage could certainly be substantial against lightly built vessels. The primary purpose was to completely silence the ship's defensive weapons and create terror among the crew members who were still alive. Then came the bombs, delivered using the skip bombing technique that Kenny had theorized about for years. At approximately 200 to 400 yards distance, flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb equipped with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft traveling horizontally at 300 miles per hour, strike the water surface, and skip across it like a stone thrown by a child playing at a pond. The bomb would bounce once or perhaps twice depending on release parameters, then slam into the side of the target ship at or slightly below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb would not detonate on initial impact with either the water or the ship's hull. Instead, the bomb would penetrate through the hull plating, sink slightly beneath the surface, and then detonate underwater. The explosion occurred in the most vulnerable part of any ship, below the armor belt where hull plating was thinnest to save weight. The blast effect was substantially enhanced by the incompressibility of water, which transmitted shockwaves with devastating efficiency. A single 500-pound bomb exploding below the waterline could break a ship's keel structure, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine rooms, and cause catastrophic structural failure that would sink even large vessels. By the time the bomb detonated, the attacking B-25 was already well past the target, climbing rapidly to avoid the blast effects and any secondary explosions from fuel or ammunition. The entire attack sequence from opening fire to bomb release consumed approximately 10 seconds. Skip bombing techniques were not entirely new or unique to Gunn's program. The British had experimented with similar methods, and some American pilots had independently tried skip bombing against opportunity targets. But the combination of skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's specific innovation that transformed the technique from an interesting experiment into a devastatingly effective weapons system. The strafer nose converted the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defensive fire before delivering bombs. This combination would soon prove itself in the most one-sided naval battle of the Pacific War. While Gunn was modifying aircraft and developing tactics, Allied intelligence services were monitoring Japanese naval movements throughout the theatre. Ultra Intercepts, which was the code name for the comprehensive code-breaking operation that had successfully cracked Japanese naval communication codes, provided detailed information about enemy operational plans. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known by the acronym FRUMEL, was reading Japanese encrypted messages almost in real time, providing Allied commanders with intelligence advantages that were almost unfair. In late February 1943, Frumel intercepted messages indicating that a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea, and the cargo consisted of troops and supplies intended for Japanese forces fighting against Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was remarkably specific due to the comprehensive nature of the code-breaking operation. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops from the 51st Division, which was an experienced combat formation. 8 destroyers would provide escort duties and anti-aircraft protection. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and would arrive at Lae approximately 3 days later after traversing the Bismarck Sea. This represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce their New Guinea garrison with experienced troops. If the convoy succeeded in delivering its cargo, Japanese forces would be significantly strengthened and might be capable of stopping Allied advances. If the convoy failed and the troops were lost, Japan would likely never attempt another major reinforcement operation by sea in the region. General Kenny immediately recognized this as an extraordinary opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactical concepts against the most important strategic target since Pearl Harbor. He began assembling every operational aircraft in the theater for a massive coordinated attack. The strike force would include B-17 flying fortresses conducting conventional bombing from medium altitude to force Japanese ships to maneuver, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters executing strafing attacks at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air superiority cover against Japanese fighters, and the modified B-25 strafers performing skip bombing attacks that would actually sink the ships. It would constitute the largest coordinated air operation conducted in the Southwest Pacific Theatre to that date. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th, ensuring everyone understood their specific roles. The orders he issued were explicit and unambiguous. Find the convoy, attack without any mercy whatsoever, give absolutely no quarter, and sink every single ship. This was not a harassment raid or a reconnaissance in force. This was calculated annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, The Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, whose flag flew from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy comprised 8 cargo transports named Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Ayo Maru, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers provided protection, specifically Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly continuous air cover patrols during the voyage to defend against air attack. The convoy represented the strongest force Japan had assembled for any resupply mission in the theatre, and Japanese commanders fully expected to lose some ships during the passage. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses from Allied air attacks, but planners believed enough vessels would survive to deliver the troops and supplies. They were catastrophically wrong in that assessment. The convoy was initially spotted that same afternoon by a B-24 Liberator conducting routine patrol. The aircrew immediately radioed the position, course, and composition to headquarters. Kenny's command launched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain continuous contact with the convoy throughout its voyage. Weather conditions initially favoured the Japanese forces as 2 tropical storms moved through the operational area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft maintained radar contact but could not execute effective attacks through the storms, and the convoy made reasonably good progress at 7 knots, which translated to approximately 8 miles per hour. The painfully slow speed was dictated by the heavily loaded transports that wallowed through the seas. The destroyers were capable of making 20 knots or more, but they had to match the convoy's pace to provide effective protection. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles and were roughly halfway to Leh. The weather continued deteriorating, which Rear Admiral Kimura welcomed since poor weather meant reduced Allied air activity. But the storms also generated rough seas that pounded the overloaded transports mercilessly. Troops packed into the holds below decks suffered terribly from seasickness in the crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. On the morning of March 2nd, 1943, weather conditions improved slightly, and Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained visual contact with the convoy. At approximately 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet altitude using conventional high-altitude bombing techniques. The results were predictably ineffective given the historical accuracy rates. The B-17 aircrews claimed multiple hits, but Japanese records indicate minimal actual damage, with perhaps 1 transport slightly damaged. The attack did serve one useful purpose by forcing the convoy to alter course repeatedly, which slowed their progress toward Leh significantly. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued against the convoy. The flying fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes while ships maneuvered frantically, and Japanese fighters engaged the bombers with considerable aggression. Several B-17s sustained battle damage, and 3 Japanese fighters were shot down in the engagements, but not a single ship was sunk by the high-altitude attacks. The bombers were harassing and delaying the convoy without stopping it. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny understood that the critical attack would occur the following morning. The modified B-25 strafers were prepared and armed. Major Lana had thoroughly briefed his pilots on the attack procedures, and they had rehearsed the tactics repeatedly, using a wrecked ship as a practice target. Every pilot understood exactly what was expected. The skip bombing technique had been practiced until it became almost routine. The strafer guns had been meticulously harmonized. The ordnance had been loaded and fused. The point of no return was rapidly approaching. At dawn on March 3rd, 1943, weather conditions were absolutely perfect for conducting air operations. Clear skies, excellent visibility, and calm seas created ideal circumstances that Rear Admiral Kimura must have viewed with considerable dread. His convoy sat approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough that land-based anti-aircraft artillery could theoretically provide some supporting fire, but still completely vulnerable to sustained air attack. The Allied strike force had assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua during the pre-dawn hours. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged for the operation, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, modified B-25 Strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters providing fighter escort. Multiple attack waves would strike from different directions throughout the morning in carefully coordinated sequence. The attack commenced at approximately 10 in the morning, with B-17 strikes first from medium altitude, which diverted Japanese attention and forced ships to begin maneuvering defensively. Then the low-altitude attack aircraft arrived and everything changed. Beaufighters swept in first, strafing with their devastating armament of 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, systematically suppressing anti-aircraft fire positions. The Japanese destroyers opened fire with every weapon available, but the closing speed of 300 miles per hour was simply too fast for manual gun laying. Then the modified B-25 Strafers arrived, and the systematic slaughter commenced. One pilot selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his specific target and pushed his control yoke forward to descend to 50 feet above the water surface. At 1,000 yards distance, he squeezed the master trigger and 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. 6,800 rounds per minute, combined rate of fire, 180 pounds of projectiles per second, concentrated into a devastating stream that ripped into the transport ship. Tracer rounds showed exactly where the bullets were impacting, and the fire methodically walked from the bow toward the superstructure, literally shredding everything in its path. Sailors were cut down where they stood without any chance to take cover. Anti-aircraft gun positions were blown apart by the impacts. The bridge structure disintegrated under the sustained fire. Metal fragments and debris flew in all directions as the concentrated firepower tore through the lightly built merchant vessel. Then he released his bombs at approximately 200 yards from the target. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs equipped with delayed fuses dropped cleanly away from the aircraft. They struck the water surface, skipped once in perfect execution of the technique, and slammed into the hull of Kyokusei Maru just below the waterline amidships. The pilot immediately pulled up hard and banked away to clear the area. Behind him, both bombs detonated almost simultaneously. 2 massive underwater explosions essentially ripped the bottom out of Kyokusei Maru in a catastrophic structural failure. The transport lurched violently as water poured into the engine rooms and cargo holds with tremendous force. The ship immediately began settling by the stern while listing heavily to port. It would sink completely within 15 minutes, taking most of its cargo and hundreds of troops down with it. Other modified B-25s followed in successive waves, each pilot selecting an individual target and executing the same devastating attack sequence. Guns blazing to suppress defences, bombs skipping across the water to strike below the waterline, ships exploding and sinking. The transport Kembu Maru absorbed direct attacks from at least 3 different B-25s during the morning. The combined machine gun fire killed most of the crew members above decks before they could even react. 4 bombs struck the hull below the waterline at different points along the ship's length. The cumulative damage was so severe that the ship literally broke in half and sank in less than 10 minutes with nearly 1,000 troops still trapped in the holds below. Teiyo Maru was strafed so heavily that fires broke out across multiple sections of the superstructure from the tracer rounds. 2 bombs penetrated the hull and detonated in the engine room, causing complete loss of propulsion. The transport went down rapidly with its cargo of troops and supplies. Nojima attempted to maneuver evasively, but the ship was far too slow and unresponsive to avoid the attacking aircraft. A B-25 Strafer raked the vessel from stern to bow with sustained machine gun fire, then placed 2 bombs directly into the engine room with textbook precision. The ship lost all power immediately and began taking on water at an uncontrollable rate. It would sink later that same day. The Beaufighters and some B-25s shifted their attention to attacking the destroyer escorts that were attempting to defend the convoy. The destroyer Shirayuki, which was Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship, sustained hits from concentrated strafing fire that killed nearly everyone on the bridge, including Kimura himself, who was seriously wounded. A bomb struck near the stern section, initiating a catastrophic magazine fire that triggered secondary explosions. These explosions literally blew the entire stern section off the destroyer, which sank rapidly after losing structural integrity. Tokitsukaze absorbed direct bomb hits that ignited fuel storage tanks, transforming the destroyer into a floating inferno that burned uncontrollably. The ship was abandoned by surviving crew members and sank within the hour. Arashio collided with the crippled transport Nojima while attempting evasive maneuvers in the confined waters and suffered heavy structural damage from the collision. The destroyer was subsequently abandoned and sank. Throughout the sustained attack, Japanese Zero fighters attempted desperately to protect the convoy from the devastating air assault, but the tactical situation made effective defense nearly impossible. The P-38 Lightning fighters engaged the Zeros at high altitude in furious dogfights, while the B-25s operated at masthead height, where Japanese fighters could not safely attack without risking collision with their own ships or flying into the water. The coordination between different aircraft types was essentially perfect, with each element performing its assigned role flawlessly. The initial attack phase lasted approximately 40 minutes of continuous combat. When the Allied aircraft finally withdrew to return to base for rearming and refueling, the scene floating on the Bismarck Sea was absolutely apocalyptic. 4 transport ships were actively sinking or had already disappeared beneath the surface. 3 destroyers were gone. The remaining vessels were scattered across miles of ocean, some damaged, all operating in complete chaos as their command structure had been shattered. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors were in the water clinging to wreckage and debris. Bodies floated among the oil slicks and burning fuel. The carefully organized convoy had been transformed into a scene of utter devastation in less than an hour. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes against the surviving ships that were attempting to limp toward Leh. The modified B-25 strafers methodically located each remaining vessel and executed their attacks with the same devastating efficiency demonstrated during the morning raids. Each ship was individually targeted and attacked until it sank. The strafer B-25s approached at minimum altitude with all guns firing, then delivered skip bombs with practiced precision. Additional transports disappeared beneath the waves. The destroyer Asashio, which had already sustained damage during the morning attacks, absorbed more bombs and went under. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transport ships and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk in what represented one of the most one-sided naval battles in military history. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning in the Bismarck Sea. Another 2,700 would eventually be rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines that were dispatched from Rabaul on emergency rescue missions. Only about 1,200 troops from the original force of 6,900 would eventually reach Leh, and most of those arrived without their weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked on the convoy, more than 5,700 became casualties, which represented an approximately 83% loss rate. The convoy had been utterly annihilated. Allied losses during the entire battle were remarkably light considering the scale of the engagement. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down by Japanese fighters. 3 P-38 Lightning fighters were lost in air-to-air combat. 13 aircrew members were killed. When compared to the catastrophic Japanese losses, the battle barely qualified as a skirmish from the Allied perspective. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it came to be officially designated in historical records, represented a fundamental turning point in the Pacific War that had implications far beyond the immediate tactical results. It demonstrated conclusively and beyond any doubt that land-based aircraft could completely destroy a heavily escorted naval convoy operating in open water. It proved definitively that skip bombing techniques, when combined with overwhelming forward-firing armament, were devastatingly effective against surface vessels. It validated every single modification that Gunn had made to the B-25 Mitchell, transforming it from an ineffective medium-altitude bomber into the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the theatre. Most importantly, from a strategic perspective, the battle convinced Japanese military leadership that attempting to resupply forward garrisons by sea within range of Allied air bases was no longer operationally feasible. Never again would Japan attempt a major convoy operation to New Guinea, which meant that Japanese forces already there would slowly deteriorate as supplies dwindled and replacements never arrived. General MacArthur issued an official communiqué claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, with over 12,000 troops killed. The actual verified numbers were somewhat lower than these claims, but the losses were still absolutely devastating to Japanese operational capability. The exaggerations in the official announcements were entirely typical of wartime propaganda from all sides. What truly mattered was not the precise accounting, but rather the strategic impact of the battle. Kenny had comprehensively proven that his tactical concepts were valid and his modified aircraft were effective. Skip bombing was a viable technique for sinking ships. Modified bombers equipped with heavy forward armament could suppress defensive fire and survive to deliver their ordnance. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite encountering heavy defensive fire. Paul Gunn, monitoring reports from Australia as information filtered back from the battle area, must have experienced grim satisfaction rather than celebration. His unauthorized modifications had resulted in the destruction of an entire Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops who would never reach the Philippines. But his family remained imprisoned in Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, and the war that separated them was far from over. The success at the Bismarck Sea led to immediate and dramatic expansion of the entire modification program. Kenny issued orders for all available B-25 Mitchell bombers in the theatre to be converted to strafer configuration as quickly as maintenance facilities could accomplish the work. Gunn intensified his already exhausting work schedule, training additional maintenance crews in modification procedures, continuously refining techniques to improve efficiency, and steadily increasing production rates. By mid-1943, the vast majority of B-25 bombers operating in the Southwest Pacific had been modified with strafer noses and additional armament. North American Aviation, which manufactured the B-25, took considerable notice of the modifications being performed in theatre. Company representatives travelled to Australia, carefully examined Gunn's workshops and modified aircraft, and requested comprehensive technical specifications and detailed engineering drawings. The company wanted to incorporate Gunn's field modifications into factory production of new aircraft. Gunn was promoted to the rank of major and was sent back to the United States specifically to work with North American aviation engineers at their manufacturing plants in Inglewood, California and Kansas City, Kansas. He spent several months during late 1943 and early 1944 collaborating with factory engineers to design production versions of strafer B-25s that incorporated his modifications. The result of this collaboration was the B-25G model, which mounted a massive 75mm cannon in the solid nose along with 450 caliber machine guns. 405 B-25G aircraft were eventually built at the factories. The 75mm cannon fired a 14.7-pound high explosive shell that could theoretically penetrate ship armor or destroy fortified bunkers with a single hit. But the weapon proved problematic in actual service because it was extremely difficult to reload in flight, required a dedicated crew member working in the nose compartment, and had an extremely slow rate of fire compared to machine guns. Gunn personally tested the B-25G variant in actual combat conditions, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer. He successfully hit the ship's fire control system with the 75mm cannon, which disabled the destroyer's ability to coordinate its defensive guns effectively. The ship was subsequently sunk by conventional bombs dropped by following aircraft. Gunn insisted publicly in after-action reports that he had sunk the destroyer with the cannon alone, but he privately admitted to close associates that it was actually the conventional bombs that finished the vessel. The B-25H model followed the G model into full production, with 1,000 B-25H aircraft eventually built incorporating the 75mm cannon and an almost absurd total of 1450 caliber machine guns arranged in various positions throughout the airframe. The H model relocated the dorsal turret to a forward position for better fields of fire and actually eliminated the co-pilot position entirely to save weight, with the navigator taking on the additional duty of loading the nose cannon. The absolutely massive firepower available in the H model came at considerable cost in terms of aircraft handling characteristics. The B-25H was distinctly nose-heavy, difficult to control during certain flight regimes, and challenging for less experienced pilots to land safely. Wright Field, which was the Army Air Force's primary development and testing center, sent Gunn an official message stating that the modification created unacceptable handling characteristics and aircraft should be immediately grounded until the center of gravity issues could be properly resolved through engineering analysis. According to stories that circulated widely, Gunn supposedly replied with a message stating simply to put center of gravity concerns in storage for the duration of the war because there were more important matters to address. The story may be apocryphal or exaggerated, but it perfectly captured Gunn's fundamental attitude toward technical regulations. Achieving technical perfection mattered considerably less than achieving combat effectiveness, and pilots would simply learn to compensate for handling peculiarities. The final production variant, the B-25J model, actually reverted to offering both a conventional bombardier nose on some aircraft, while retaining the strafer nose configuration on others, giving commanders flexibility in how they equipped squadrons. 4,318 B-25J aircraft were manufactured, making it by far the most numerous variant of the entire Mitchell production run. Some B-25J aircraft were equipped with a truly staggering armament package consisting of 8 forward-firing guns mounted in the solid nose, 4 guns in cheek blisters, 2 guns in the forward dorsal turret, and additional guns in waist positions, bringing total armament to 1850 caliber machine guns, which made it the most heavily armed bomber aircraft of the entire Second World War. The firepower was probably excessive and unnecessary for most tactical situations, but it had tremendous psychological impact on enemy forces who learned to fear the distinctive sound of approaching Mitchell engines. Japanese troops throughout the Pacific came to fear and recognize the characteristic roar of the twin right radial engines because that sound meant that death was literally incoming within seconds. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25 Strafer aircraft systematically devastated Japanese targets across the entire Pacific theater of operations. In August 1943, B-25 Strafers executed a massive coordinated attack against Japanese airfields at Wewak on the northern coast of New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 enemy aircraft on the ground in a series of low-level strafing attacks, effectively breaking the back of Japanese air power in that entire region. The Wewak raids were only possible because Gunn had solved yet another significant technical problem involving operational range. B-25 aircraft had sufficient range for most tactical missions, but Wewak was at the absolute limit of combat radius from available Allied bases. Gunn developed an improvised technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried internally in the bomb bay. Once the additional fuel was completely consumed, the empty tanks were simply jettisoned through an opened bomb bay, falling into the ocean or jungle below. The system was admittedly crude, with fuel fumes permeating the entire fuselage and creating a fire hazard, and wind blowing through the open bomb bay making conditions uncomfortable. But the modification extended operational range by several hundred crucial miles. The Wewak raids permanently ended Japanese air superiority over New Guinea and allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal air opposition threatening their supply lines. In November 1943, B-25 Strafers executed one of the most spectacular raids of the entire war against Rabaul Harbour, which was the most heavily defended Japanese base in the region. Major Raymond Wilkins, nicknamed Jock, led 38 B-25 strafers against shipping concentrated in the harbour in broad daylight. The attack occurred at masthead height, with P-38 Lightning fighters providing top cover against Japanese fighters and phosphorus bombs, creating smoke screens to obscure the attacking bombers. Of 38 Japanese vessels present in the harbour at the time of the attack, 30 received direct hits from either bombs or sustained machine gun fire. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transport and support vessels were either sunk outright or so severely damaged they were no longer operational. The raid effectively paralysed Rabaul as a forward operating base and demonstrated conclusively that even the strongest Japanese defensive positions were vulnerable to concentrated attacks by modified B-25 strafers. During the Philippines campaign throughout 1944, B-25 strafers provided continuous close air support for advancing ground forces, systematically destroyed Japanese supply lines and communication nodes, and attacked shipping throughout the entire Philippine archipelago. The aircraft became universally known among both Allied and Japanese forces as flying bats out of hell, because the attacks materialized so quickly at such low altitude that defenders literally had no time whatsoever to react effectively. Gunn's modified B-25 aircraft were obviously not the only weapon system contributing to Allied victory in the Pacific War, but they were among the most consistently effective throughout the campaign. They destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships of all sizes, thousands of aircraft caught on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops who would otherwise have continued fighting. They enabled General MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by systematically isolating Japanese garrisons from any hope of resupply or reinforcement. They provided Allied forces with air superiority that made amphibious landing operations feasible against defended beaches. But throughout all of this operational success, Gunn's family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Letters occasionally reached him through Red Cross channels, but communication was sporadic, heavily censored by Japanese authorities, and provided minimal information about actual conditions. He understood that conditions in the internment camp were steadily deteriorating as the war situation turned increasingly desperate for Japan. Japanese guards became progressively harsher as news of military defeats filtered through. Food supplies became increasingly scarce as the Japanese military requisitioned everything for their own forces. Disease spread through the overcrowded camp as sanitation facilities failed. Gunn could do absolutely nothing to help his family except continue fighting with maximum intensity, desperately hoping that each mission somehow brought the war's conclusion slightly closer. In late 1944, American forces finally invaded Leyte in the Philippines, beginning the Liberation Campaign. Gunn was there, still actively flying combat missions despite being 45 years old and despite regulations that should have grounded him based on age alone. He was still constantly searching for new methods to destroy enemy forces more efficiently. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte, where Gunn was based. He was physically on the ground when white phosphorus bombs exploded near his position. Metal fragments tore into his shoulder, causing massive tissue damage and shattering bone. The wound was severe enough that it rendered his right arm essentially useless and caused excruciating pain. He was medically evacuated to Australia for emergency treatment and would spend many months in painful recovery. The wound permanently ended Gunn's career as a combat pilot, but his personal war was nearly over regardless. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division conducting a flying column raid deep into Manila successfully liberated Santo Tomas internment camp. The cavalry troopers arrived literally just as Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp's leadership in response to the American advance. In the absolute chaos of Manila's brutal street-to-street fighting, American soldiers freed more than 4,000 internees who had survived years of imprisonment. Among those liberated were Polly Gunn and her 4 children, who had somehow survived 3 years and 14 days of internment under increasingly harsh conditions. The family was severely emaciated, psychologically traumatized by their experiences, but miraculously alive. General MacArthur personally visited the newly liberated camp shortly after the cavalry secured it and specifically met with the Gunn family, having been aware of their situation. He personally arranged for the family to be flown to Australia on the first available military transport to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The long-delayed reunion occurred several weeks after the liberation. The man who had evacuated from Manila on Christmas Eve, 1941, finally held his family again after more than 3 years of desperate fighting and constant worry. Polly had somehow managed to keep the children together and alive through absolutely impossible circumstances. The boys, who were now young men rather than teenagers, had survived the forced separation of male and female quarters within the camp. The daughters had endured years of severe deprivation and constant fear. They were finally together again, but they were fundamentally different people than they had been before the war. The traumatic experiences had changed them all in ways that would never completely heal. Gunn remained in the Army Air Force after eventually recovering sufficiently from his wounds to return to limited duty. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modification programs and tactical doctrine development, though he never flew combat missions again. He formally retired from active military service on June 30, 1948, with the permanent rank of full colonel, receiving a medical retirement based on his combat injuries. His extensive collection of military decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster indicating he had earned the decoration twice, the Silver Star for gallantry, the Legion of Merit for exceptional service, the Air Medal for aerial combat, an almost unprecedented 9 Purple Hearts representing 9 separate occasions on which he was wounded or injured during combat operations, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons representing his extensive service. Gunn returned to the Philippines after retirement and worked to re-establish Philippine Airlines, which had been completely destroyed during the Japanese occupation and the subsequent liberation fighting. The entire country was attempting to rebuild from years of brutal occupation and the massive destruction caused by the liberation campaign. Gunn helped restore essential air transportation services, reconnecting islands that had been isolated from each other. He was still flying aircraft, still accepting risks, still pushing against established limitations, even in civilian aviation. On October 11, 1957, exactly 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was piloting a charter flight when his aircraft encountered an extremely severe tropical storm. The plane crashed in conditions that would have challenged any pilot regardless of experience level. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died doing exactly what he had done for nearly 40 years of his life, which was flying aircraft. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, the same facility where he had once served as a flight instructor decades earlier. His legacy survived in multiple distinct forms that continued influencing military aviation long after his death. The B-25 strafer modifications that he pioneered and developed remained standard configuration throughout the remainder of the war. Approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchell bombers were manufactured during the war years, and many thousands of those were configured as strafers based directly on Gunn's original field modifications. The skip bombing technique that he helped perfect through experimentation and combat testing destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships throughout the Pacific and contributed significantly to Allied victory by strangling Japanese supply lines. Gunn's career demonstrated conclusively that innovation could originate from unexpected sources, including unauthorized modifications performed by a grieving father working in a maintenance hangar with scavenged parts. The official military bureaucracy had wanted to fight the entire war using existing approved weapons and established tactics developed during peacetime. Gunn showed definitively that desperate wartime circumstances required desperate innovations, regardless of whether those innovations followed approved procedures. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a standard case study taught at military academies worldwide for decades afterward. The combination of accurate intelligence, precise coordination between different aircraft types, innovative weapons, and revolutionary tactics achieved a complete and overwhelming victory at absolutely minimal cost to the attacking force. It demonstrated exactly what properly employed air power could accomplish against naval surface forces. 8 transport ships destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 casualties inflicted, all achieved at the cost of only 4 Allied aircraft lost. The mathematics were brutally simple and completely convincing. Naval forces could not survive in any operational environment where the enemy controlled the air and possessed effective anti-ship weapons. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of future missions that would never be flown, hundreds of troops who would never reach the battlefield, thousands of rounds of ammunition that would never be fired at Allied forces. Destroying supplies and reinforcements before they reached the combat zone was the most efficient possible form of warfare. The modified B-25 Strafer became the primary weapon system that made this strategic concept operationally feasible. The aircraft could range hundreds of miles from base to locate enemy shipping, suppress defensive fire with overwhelming machine gun firepower, destroy vessels with precisely delivered skip bombs, and return safely to base. After the devastating Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese military commanders understood they could no longer safely move large convoys during daylight hours within operational range of Allied air bases. They adapted by switching to nighttime movements that were harder to detect, used submarines for transporting critical supplies that absolutely had to get through, and increasingly relied on small barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters and vegetation during daylight hours. These countermeasures reduced losses but absolutely did not eliminate them. B-25 strafers hunted barges along coastlines with the same ruthless efficiency they had demonstrated against larger ships. Night-flying B-25s equipped with primitive radar systems found convoys operating in darkness. There was literally no safe time, no safe transportation method, no safe location for Japanese logistics operations anywhere in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The stranglehold on Japanese supply lines tightened progressively month by month until enemy garrisons were effectively completely isolated from any support. Throughout New Guinea, throughout the Philippines, throughout all the Pacific Islands under Japanese control, enemy troops continued fighting with steadily dwindling supplies and absolutely no realistic hope of reinforcement or relief. They demonstrated courage and tenacity despite their impossible situation, but they were ultimately doomed by logistics. The air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25 Strafer made their individual courage strategically irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the universally recognized standard anti-shipping weapon throughout the Pacific Theater. The aircraft continued evolving with the B-25G, H, and J variants incorporating progressively heavier armament and refined modifications. But the fundamental concept remained exactly what Gunn had originally innovated, which was a medium bomber transformed into a flying weapons platform that could suppress enemy defenses and deliver devastating attacks at minimum altitude. When the war finally ended in August 1945, following the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the conflict, modified B-25 Strafers were still actively flying combat missions. They were among the aircraft that provided escort for the Japanese surrender delegation when it flew from Japan to Manila in mid-August to receive surrender instructions. It was entirely fitting that the aircraft that had contributed so substantially to defeating Japan would be present to witness its formal surrender. Post-war historical analysis conducted by both American and Japanese military historians confirmed the strategic significance of Gunn's innovations. Japanese naval officers stated explicitly in post-war interviews that after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they understood they could not safely operate surface vessels in waters within range of Allied air bases equipped with Strafer aircraft. The psychological impact proved as strategically important as the actual physical destruction. Convoy commanders understood that low-flying bombers could appear without any warning whatsoever and destroy entire formations before defensive measures could respond effectively. Modified B-25 strafers had created an entirely new category of warfare, where medium bombers hunted ships with the operational efficiency of submarines, combined with the concentrated firepower of light cruisers. The tactical and strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate Pacific War context. Post-war air forces worldwide carefully studied the demonstrated lessons of skip bombing combined with heavy forward-firing armament. The fundamental concept of the gunship, meaning an aircraft designed primarily for direct-fire gun attack rather than conventional bombing, became standard doctrine in numerous air forces globally. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunship aircraft that were extensively used during the Vietnam War and in subsequent conflicts were direct conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25 strafers, applying the same basic principles of overwhelming firepower from aircraft. Of the 9,890 B-25 Mitchell bombers manufactured during the war years, more than 100 individual aircraft survive today in various conditions, with most located in the United States. Many are maintained in fully airworthy flying condition and regularly appear at air shows where crowds invariably marvel at their impressive size, distinctive sound, and historical significance. The characteristic roar of Wright R2600 radial engines remains absolutely unforgettable to anyone who has heard it. The sight of a B-25 banking low over an airfield, exactly as they did over Japanese convoy ships, provides observers with a visceral reminder of what these aircraft actually accomplished during the war. Several flying B-25 aircraft are specifically configured as strafers with forward-firing machine guns installed in the nose. When these guns are fired during airshow demonstrations using blank ammunition that produces muzzle blast without projectiles, the sound is absolutely overwhelming even from a safe distance. The visible muzzle blast is dramatic and the entire aircraft shudders noticeably from the recoil forces. Watching a B-25 strafer firing demonstration gives modern audiences a small glimpse of the terrifying experience that Japanese sailors endured in the final seconds before their ships were destroyed. Museums throughout the world display B-25 aircraft in various historical configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force, located in Dayton, Ohio, maintains multiple examples representing different variants. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, the same facility where Gunn once served as a flight instructor, displays a B-25 as part of its collection. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserves and presents the historical record for future generations. Each surviving aircraft tells the compelling story of innovation born from desperation and the ultimate achievement of victory through unconventional means. In 1959, General George Kenney, by then long retired from active military service, published a biography titled The Saga of Pappy Gunn, documenting the life of the man whose unauthorized innovations had fundamentally changed the nature of the Pacific War. Kenney wanted to ensure that Gunn's extraordinary contributions would not be forgotten or overlooked by official military histories that often focused on conventional commanders and established units. The book provided detailed descriptions of Gunn's modifications, his numerous combat missions, and his intensely personal war to liberate his imprisoned family. Kenney wrote explicitly that Gunn was one of the most strategically important individuals in the entire Pacific War, a maverick whose unauthorized actions had directly saved thousands of Allied lives and measurably shortened the duration of the conflict. Nathaniel Gunn, who was Pappy's youngest son, also eventually wrote extensively about his father's story and the family's experiences. His books provided the family's perspective on events, describing in detail the harsh conditions of life in Santo Tomas internment camp and the seemingly endless wait for liberation. The Gunn family story became a powerful example of the profound human cost of warfare and the extraordinary strength required to endure prolonged suffering. In 1975, the United States Air Force formally honored Gunn posthumously by naming a training facility after him in recognition of his contributions. The official recognition was long overdue but deeply heartfelt. Gunn had never actively sought personal glory or public recognition. He had sought operational effectiveness and the destruction of enemy forces, period. The story of how one determined engineer's completely unauthorized aircraft modifications created a devastatingly effective weapons system remains strategically relevant to modern military thinking. Gunn absolutely refused to accept his family's imprisonment as an inevitable circumstance beyond his control. He refused to accept that existing authorized weapons were adequate for the mission. He refused to accept peacetime regulations that actively prevented necessary innovation during wartime. That fundamental refusal to accept limitations, combined with exceptional technical skill and General Kenny's crucial support, produced modifications that genuinely changed the nature of warfare in the Pacific. The B-25 strafer destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships of all types, killed thousands of enemy troops, and contributed measurably and significantly to Allied victory throughout the Pacific theatre. The larger lesson is that genuinely effective innovation can originate from completely unexpected sources and succeed through thoroughly unorthodox methods that violate established procedures. The modified B-25 strafer was obviously not the single weapon that won the entire Second World War. That ultimate victory required contributions from literally millions of people using thousands of different weapons systems over 4 years of brutal global conflict spanning multiple continents and oceans. But the modified B-25 strafer achieved strategic effects that were dramatically disproportionate to the resources invested in developing it. The weapon emerged from a maintenance hangar, born from one man's desperation and grief. It flew into combat at masthead height, with all guns blazing, delivering skip bombs that skipped across water surfaces to slam into enemy hulls and detonate below the waterline with catastrophic effect. It systematically destroyed Japanese hopes of reinforcing and resupplying their forward garrisons. It measurably shortened the war's duration. It directly saved Allied lives by destroying enemy forces before they reached combat zones. And ultimately, it freed one specific family from more than 3 years of brutal imprisonment, which from Paul Gunn's intensely personal perspective was the entire point all along.